Investment lessons from the 7 faces of fraud. If I were to ask you, what do all these individuals and groups have in common? You might be confused, but the one thing that ties them all together, from John Malkovich to Jeffrey Katzenberg, from Zsa Gabor to Elie Wiesel to Kevin Bacon, is that they were all victims of Bernard J. Madoff. These prominent individuals are just a handful of the 30 million people around the world that fall victim to investment fraud every year. It didn't matter if they were educated or unschooled, prominent or unknown, self-made or third-generation wealth, all share the same exact fate. In fact, what's most surprising is that investment fraud victims score higher on financial literacy measures than non-victims. In other words, those who are more financially literate are more likely to be victims of investment fraud. Ingredients of fraud. The reason today's conversation is important because every single fraud has at least 3 basic ingredients: the platform, the perpetrator, and the victim. We cannot do anything about the first 2. The fraudster in particular often has no conscience. In many cases, these are psychopathic individuals lacking empathy and basic neural wiring that would prevent most people from stealing from charities, retirees, and friends who have entrusted them with everything that they have. We cannot even relate to their sickness. But what we can do a lot about is the third. We can avoid being the target. The challenge is that we all have human frailties. We all think we are smarter, less likely to be deceived, and not as greedy as the other guy. And yet, we all look for shortcuts. We're often too lazy to do our homework, too uncomfortable to ask the difficult questions. We are too reliant on our first impressions, have too much regard for authority, and too trusting of our emotions and our relationships. All of these cause us to ignore that little voice inside our heads that says, this is simply too good to be true. And that is why after the fact, victims often say, I should have seen it. The warning signs were obvious. How could I have missed that? So what forms of protection do we actually have? 4 protections against fraud. In simple terms, we have these 4 methods of protecting ourselves against fraud. Enforcement protection, in other words, the police. Legal protection, the law, suing the perpetrators. Regulatory protection, the Ontario Securities Commission here in Ontario, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. Diligence protection, in other words, your own cautious research and due diligence. The problem with enforcement is that they will be the last ones on the scene. Legal protection comes only after all the pain and anxiety has been experienced, and only if there's anything left to spare. And regulatory protection has proven to be woefully helpless, as a shocking number of fraud cases were known to the regulators long before they unraveled, including the biggest fraud in history, the Madoff affair, which the SEC knew about for at least 6 years, but did nothing about it. That leaves us with the only protection we can count on: our own vigilance in employing proper due diligence, and that starts with education. 7 faces of fraud. So before we jump into the stories, let me get right to the punchline and the chart summarizing today's discussion. In my research, I have found that there are basically 7 faces of fraud. I have placed these 7 faces in 3 broader categories of asset misappropriation, financial statement manipulation, and corruption. As far as it affects us, we know that approximately 85% of all investment fraud cases are a function of asset misappropriation. Yet, in absolute dollar numbers, over 90% of the total value lost to fraud relates to financial statement manipulation and corruption. Either way, the numbers are colossal. According to the Associations of Certified Fraud Examiners, the global cost of fraud is about $4 trillion per year. That is almost 5% of global output. Now, I personally think this estimate is quite high, but even if it's half or a fourth of that number, we owe it to ourselves not to fall victim to it. So let's dive right into the first face of fraud: the infamous Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme fraud is perhaps the most common of all these categories. In simple terms, it involves borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. In other words, returns are paid to previous investors from capital brought in by new investors, rather than from profit earned through legitimate business or economic activity. It's important to remember that Ponzi schemes can come in the most unexpected shapes and sizes. For example, Canada was home to a Ponzi scheme that sounds too silly to be true. It started in 2001 when Arlen Galbraith started running ads in small farming magazines, recruiting investors for Pigeon King International. Galbraith, who claimed to have bred pigeons for 50 years, referred to himself as the Pigeon King, claimed to have developed his own genetic line of pigeons, and insisted he had contracts with wealthy pigeon racers in the Middle East. Between 2001 to June 2008, Galbraith built Pigeon King International into an empire by selling breeding pairs of pigeons to farmers with a guarantee to buy them back or buy back their offspring at a fixed price for 10 years. Initially, Galbraith told farmers that the birds were high-end racing pigeons and that he was selling them to lucrative markets that support the sport overseas. Later, Galbraith changed his story, telling farmers that the birds were part of his trailblazing plan to elevate pigeon meat, known as squab, from a fringe delicacy to being as popular as chicken. But in the end, neither was true. Galbraith never sold a single pigeon for sport or for meat. He merely took the young birds that he bought from Pigeon King International farmers and resold them as breeding pairs to other Pigeon King International farmers, continually recruiting new investors so he would have the cash to buy the pigeons his investors produced. When Galbraith's scheme finally fell apart, Pigeon King International had almost 1,000 breeders under contract in 5 Canadian provinces and 20 U.S. states. He had taken nearly $42 million from farmers and walked away from obligations to buy back $356 million worth of baby birds with a trumped-up value of over $1.5 billion, ruining many farmers and investors along the way. Ponzi fraud lessons and red flags. Too good to be true. If Galbraith was truly generating those returns, there would be an endless stream of competitors coming into the market. Yet it never happened. Not one competitor was even attempting to get into the game. Factual disconnect. Nobody but Galbraith bothered to realize the profits he claimed were impossible for the market that he was in. And it was later discovered that the pigeons that they were breeding were too small for squab and not refined enough for racing. Difficult to diligence. The nature of many frauds is that they usually involve some foreign, overseas, or some convoluted strategy that's extremely difficult to conduct due diligence on, often defaulting to whether or not they trust the operator. No objective third party. There was no objective third-party information that could be found about the company. Just like Madoff, Galbraith didn't have any independent verification of his activities, not even an independent auditor to verify his financials. Style or strategy drift. Inconsistencies with Pigeon King's purpose. Initially, Galbraith insisted his birds were racing pigeons and dismissed squab as unprofitable. Then he described the birds that Pigeon King farmers were raising as part of a long-term breeding program to create superior bird meat. Investing and passion don't mix. Best practice investing and passions rarely mix, as people tend to let their guard down when activities are concentrated on a small or passionate community, in this case, like farmers. Promotional fraud. Promotional fraud in public markets usually manifests itself in various pump-and-dump strategies, where the fraudsters attempt to artificially boost the price of a stock through false or misleading or even greatly exaggerated statements. The perpetrators of this fraud usually have an established position in the company's stock before they start the hype. And when the hype reaches a fever pitch, they sell their entire position, driving down the share price and leaving the victims of this scheme holding the bag with little value left to their shares. One of the earliest and most prominent poster boys of promotional fraud was Walter Tellier. Walter Tellier was the king of the so-called penny stock. He was the Jordan Belfort of the 1950s. His New Jersey-based brokerage firm, Tellier & Co., targeted people with manipulative sales tactics. and was the largest over-the-counter security selling organization in the US. In one example, he sold over 50,000 people shares in Consolidated Uranium Mines, Inc. People were hooked by the price of penny shares and the promise of huge profits going up to $20 a share. They believed what the radio and television ads for Tellier & Co. called a ground floor opportunity. In truth, Consolidated didn't even own the big ore field that Tellier and his sales team talked up. The net worth of Consolidated was $1 million, not the $85 million they spoke of. The president of Consolidated repeatedly complained to Tellier about the exaggerated statements in his sales pitch, though the penny stock king didn't slow down one bit. Eventually, Tellier was indicted, several times in fact, and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Promotional fraud lessons and red flags. No sure thing. There's no such thing as a surefire penny stock like Tellier claimed. Penny stocks are by their nature risky. That's why they cost so low and are not traded on regular markets. In fact, no investment is risk-free, and anytime a promoter downplays the risk by using terms such as "this is a sure thing," run in the other direction. Quality of people. History tends to repeat itself. Shortly after starting his own firm on Wall Street, Tellier was indicted on conspiracy charges and mail fraud. Though the cases were later dropped, later investors should have learned who they were dealing with. Illiquidity and perverse incentives. In penny stock scams, the brokerage firm carrying the issue is often the only place where you can buy or sell the stock. This lets the firm control the market and price without competition. In a regular market, you can buy a stock through broker X and sell it through broker Y, but in a penny stock scam, there is no other markets, which creates all sorts of moral hazards and abuses. Raging defensiveness. Do not trust someone who sues anyone that challenges their practices instead of explaining and alleviating concerns. Tellier was relentless in legally pursuing anyone that had anything negative to say about him. Decisions on the fly. Tellier made great use of the boiler room phenomenon, where people were set up in dilapidated buildings and where people would call from pretending to be from Wall Street, preying on gullible investors. Here's a tip for everyone. A phone conversation is rarely sufficient due diligence. Transaction fraud. At its core, transaction fraud involves either selling what one does not actually own or issuing fake debt and absconding with the capital. A classic example of that is the Rastogi brothers. Narendra and Virendra Rastogi were two brothers that fooled banks worldwide to loan them $680 million against assets that did not exist. They had people playing the part of metal traders in the US, Hong Kong, India, France, and Italy. Their premise was quite reasonable. Banks loaned them the fees for the metal deals they brokered, as their fees weren't paid until the metal arrived by ship, which could take months, except for the fact that there were no metal deals. They set up phony bank accounts, phony purchase orders and invoices, created letterhead, and stood ready to field phone calls from auditors. The Rostogis even invented an agency that issued fake credit reports on the fake companies, and as collateral, they created fake bill of ladings, documents issued by ships to testify that the goods had been taken on board. Often they used the same bill of lading to collect on several loans, which gave them cash to pay off earlier lenders. If it wasn't for a slip of the finger, they might have kept their swindle going for longer. In 2002, an employee in Hong Kong pressed the wrong button on the fax machine and accidentally sent a stack of letters from supposed customers intended for Virendra Rastogi to their auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, asking if the letters seemed credible enough. When London police showed up to arrest Virendra, they found him busy shredding documents, and both brothers now sit in jail. Transactional fraud lessons and red flags. Unusually long accounts receivable. RBG Resources claim to have given their customers unusually long 180-day credit windows before receiving payment. Those terms are highly unusual and potentially damaging. But of course, a company that didn't actually earn those accounts receivable had no problem giving such long pay periods. Too much borrowing and from too many sources. The Rostogis were considerably more levered than they needed to be and paid more interest than they needed to. since they use multiple credit lines from many institutions rather than working through an agent bank that kept track of everything and farmed out pieces of the loans to the other banks. That created a scenario that was ripe for abuse. Poor alignment of interest. The transactions they manufactured were deliberately complex overseas transactions. But it was clear that the brothers were not putting their own capital at risk. That should have been an immediate red flag. Fantasy fraud. We've all gotten emails telling us that our rich uncle in Nigeria just passed away and left us $500 billion. But the poor guy can't get it to us until we send him $72 to cover the postage of sending the $500 billion. This genealogy scam has been around for a long time, and one of the greatest and oldest such scams is the infamous Baker estate hoax. In the late 1800s, a group of businessmen placed ads in many American newspapers asking bakers everywhere to file for the estate of Jacob Baker, which included prime real estate in the center of Philadelphia with an estimated worth of $80 million. The ads requested bakers to send in proof showing their family once resided in Pennsylvania or was somehow related to Jacob Baker. The possibility of being heir to many millions and owning miles of prime land caused thousands of otherwise level-headed bakers to spend much of their life savings tracing their family lineage and paying attorney fees. The response was so overwhelming that the businessmen set up branches across North America and Europe, including the Ontario Baker Heirs Association right here in Canada. The Heirs Association required various sums of money from each baker several times a year, along with membership dues. The money sent to the association paid the board of directors' salary, several staff historians, newspaper ads, and filing fees. If you had a Baker ancestor, you were welcome to send in your family's filing fee and attempt to claim the estate. This was the largest heir hunt of the 19th century, and unfortunately, it was all a hoax. This was one of the most brilliantly planned and executed fantasy frauds in history. The association kept in touch with their heirs and sent progress reports on a regular basis, which added to their credibility. And the most respected lawyers, judges, and government officials were unknowingly puppets in the scam. Fantasy fraud lessons and red flags. Beware of the upfront fee. In industries where paying an upfront fee can provide a perverse incentive, beware of paying anything before seeing demonstrable and tangible results. Doing basic due diligence. It's easy to claim to own tons of real estate and historic landmarks, and it's equally easy to verify if those claims are actually true. The Baker estate professed to cover historic landmarks such as Benjamin Franklin's grave, Independence Hall, and many others. Swept up by the gold fever mentality, nobody caught up in the scam actually bothered to check if these claims were even true. Official documents can be official crap. Letterhead from government officials or institutions are ultimately only as useful as the people behind them. Fiduciary fraud. Fiduciary fraud is any scam that involves someone who is entrusted with holding or stewarding your capital, and they simply decided to sneak into the cookie jar. They may have done it for a short-term need or because they thought they'd patch something else up somewhere else. And in many cases, there was no strategic plan to steal, because that's what's often referred to as embezzlement. A classic example of fiduciary fraud was Richard Whitney. Richard Whitney was a high-flying broker with no capacity to invest capital or even manage his own finances. Whitney's career was made by being the right person in the right place at the right time. Due to his connections, he was elevated to the ranks of vice president of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929. And it just so happened that when the market crash of 1929 occurred, on that infamous Black Thursday, the president of the exchange was vacationing in Hawaii. That day, all hell broke loose, and the Dow had tumbled to 272 from 381. The leading bankers on Wall Street gathered at JP Morgan's offices to form a pool, raising $130 million to be spent on selected blue chip stocks in the hope that it would stop the panic and bring some level of confidence back into the market. Richard Whitney was chosen as the pool's agent and went to the exchange at around 1:30 p.m. to quote-unquote walk the floor. Stopping at the post for U.S. Steel, he loudly announced, "I bid 205 for 10,000 of U.S. Steel." Whitney made similar purchases of AT&T, General Electric, and many others, and it prompted an uproar among the traders. The strategy had its desired effect, and the Dow Jones roared back, closing the Black Thursday at 299. Whitney soon became a hero to many investors and was seen as the savior of the market. The heroic stature was greatly exaggerated since he was only acting for others and with money that was not his own. But that led to Whitney becoming the president of the New York Stock Exchange. The problem was that all the while Whitney was being touted as a hero, no one seemed to realize that his own brokerage firm was going under, thanks to his incredibly poor investing habits. He would lose money on crazy penny stocks, borrow from his brother or friends to cover his losses, then double down, which only compounded his problems. By 1931, Whitney was at least $2 million in debt, but he kept up his opulent lifestyle. And if he couldn't borrow, he stole from the exchange, from the New York Yacht Club, or anywhere else where he was a trustee. When the final investigations were made public, his firm was suspended and insolvent. It was estimated that Whitney had borrowed more than $30 million from his friends, his family, and the accounts in his trust. When he declared bankruptcy, he owed approximately $6.5 million and indicted for misuse of funds. Fiduciary fraud, lessons and red flags. Checks and balances. Funds cannot blindly trust their trustees and need proper checks and balances. For example, double signatures or what have you, especially when the trustee is also the fund's broker. No one is beyond reproach. After the fact, some testified that they knew something wasn't right when they discovered that a fund in Whitney's custody was short on cash. But they felt that Whitney was beyond reproach. Investors relied on his reputation rather than on diligent inspection of his activities to safeguard their money. Reputation does not equal capacity. You can never presume that association or reputation in high finance actually translates into capacity for successful investing. Just because Whitney was the president of the New York Stock Exchange didn't mean he knew the first thing about being either an investor or a fiduciary. Conflicts of interest. Lastly, putting people with their own proprietary products into a fiduciary role is inherently problematic and riddled with conflicts of interest. It was Whitney's position as the broker and trustee of the funds that allowed him to embezzle the way he did. Accounting fraud. Accounting fraud is the intentional manipulation of financial statements to mislead investors or shareholders about a particular company's financial health. It can include overstated revenues, overvalued assets, undervalued liabilities, or underdocumented expenses. In 1986, Barry Minko was the wunderkind of Wall Street. In high school, he founded ZZZ Best Carpet Cleaning, and later an insurance restoration business. He was the youngest person in history to take his company public with a valuation of $200 million. It made for a great rags to riches story when he appeared on Oprah. But the reality was, his ZZZ Best didn't have any real contracts and had originally been funded through a series of credit card thefts. When the scam was finally exposed, the stock collapsed to zero, and it was discovered that the actual assets of this $200 million Wall Street success story were just a couple of trucks and some cleaning equipment used in all the commercials, with a total book value of $64,000. Minko had managed to fool investors, bankers, lenders, and auditors. But it was ultimately a little old lady in California that led to his downfall. This woman noticed that he was repeatedly charging her credit card for non-existent services. She brought her findings to the LA Times, and then a domino effect occurred. Stock prices fell from bad publicity, and the reporter went back to the alleged office building and discovered that it was a phony, yada, yada, yada. Minko was indicted, ordered to pay $26 million in restitution, and 25 years in prison. Accounting fraud lessons and red flags. Mismatch between size and resources. For example, how is it possible that a multi-million-dollar division had only one listed employee, Barry Minko, and none of the main people running the company had any outside experience running a public or private company? Unrealistic profits. The most glaring red flag was one any investor or lender should have known. It was no comparison to other industry players. The insurance restoration industry was not one that typically garnered 50% returns. In fact, standard returns were in single digits, yet investors threw their money into a 50% return promise. Obscure auditors. The accountant who audited ZZZ Best didn't even visit any sites before the company went public. If they would have found mailboxes instead of credible buildings. The importance of site visits. For example, in 1985, Minco claimed to finance a restoration job for a $2.3 million 8-story building in Arroyo Grande, California. The problem is Arroyo Grande is a town of 13,000 souls, 5 traffic lights, and no buildings over 3 stories high. Lie in one area. Putting aside the hype and rags to riches story everyone likes, when Minco began his company, he started charging clients credit cards for services they didn't use. He was check kiting and even stealing his grandmother's jewelry. He was constantly running into debt and getting money out of people in any way that he could. Insider fraud. Insider fraud refers to any fraud where insiders of any system or a company have an unfair advantage over the rest of the market. This would include front-running or the more traditional form of insider trading. The most classic example of insider fraud was Ivan Boesky, on whom the movie Wall Street was largely based. In the mid-1980s, Boesky demonstrated an uncanny ability to pick out potential takeover targets and invest before the offer was made. When the offer came, the target's firm stock would shoot up and Boesky would sell his shares for a profit. Boesky's precognition turned out to be a fraud. Boesky paid individuals within investment banks for pre-takeover information that guided his buys. And when Boesky hit home runs on nearly every major deal in the 1980s, Getty Oil, Nabisco, Gulf Oil, Chevron, Texaco, the people at the Securities and Exchange Commission became suspicious. The SEC's break came when Merrill Lynch was tipped off that someone in the firm was leaking information. After an investigation, they discovered Swiss bank accounts linking back to Boesky's informers. Insider trading is a unique animal because it doesn't affect any one person, but compromises everyone and fosters distrust in the integrity of the market as a whole. Insider fraud, lessons and red flags. No one hits everything. No one hits a home run on every deal, and if they do, something is likely amiss. Diversification. For private investors, insider fraud is perhaps the most difficult, if not impossible, fraud to protect against. The only safeguard they have is diversification. Insider trading is fortunately quite rare, and in a portfolio of 20-plus securities, it is unlikely to have a significant impact on the portfolio as a whole. Summary. Today we went through examples in each of the 7 phases of fraud. What is most valuable about these stories is the key questions that they should prompt and which questions we should be asking in the future. I have summarized several of them here, though some of the running themes include being intimately familiar with the people involved in their histories, ensuring that there are always third-party verifications of values, transactions, and accounts. Make sure due diligence involves both dissecting information that the operator provided and information that they did not provide. Ensure opportunities make sense with the broader market and that you understand all the moving parts. Ensure the alignment of interest between the investor and operator is always there. Don't rely on prestige, name recognition, or authority, or let that get in the way of proper due diligence. Look for realistic successes, not pipe dreams. I believe that if we take all these considerations to heart, we can be safer and better stewards of our wealth.